What if I told you the 1950s, a decade obsessed with perfect suburban families, was secretly producing the most unhinged, acid trip-like cartoons in history? Forget Mickey Mouse. We are talking about surreal nightmares, blatant racism, and psychological terror disguised as children's entertainment. These aren't just old animations. They are bizarre artifacts that would never air today without causing a riot. Here are the 17 strangest cartoons from the 1950s ever made. Gerald McBoing Boing, 1950. Created by Dr. Seuss and animated by the brilliant UPA studio. Gerald McBoing Boing is a fever dream disguised as a baby face. The premise sounds simple. A little boy doesn't speak words, he speaks sound effects. But the execution is deeply unsettling. Gerald's head is a perfectly round, featureless sphere, with 2 dots for eyes and a line for a mouth. When he opens his jaw, which seems to unhinge like a snake, out come train whistles, sirens, and crashing cymbals. The animation style rejects everything Disney stood for. Instead of smooth, flowing movements, the characters jerk around like broken puppets against stark, minimalist backgrounds. There is no traditional narrative structure. It's just a series of frustrating social interactions, where adults misunderstand Gerald, leading him to run away and get exploited by a radio station for his bizarre vocal deformity. It's a surprisingly cynical take on childhood for the 1950s, treating the protagonist less like a lovable scamp and more like a tragic freak. The limited animation, which was originally a cost-saving measure, only adds to the eerie, isolating atmosphere. You feel Gerald's alienation. The short won an Academy Award, proving that in the 1950s, the industry elites were just as fascinated by the bizarre as the kids watching at home. It remains a deeply weird, avant-garde staple that feels more like an art gallery installation than a Saturday morning cartoon. Rudy Toot Toot, 1951. If you ever wanted to see a cartoon version of a brutal murder trial scored by manic, sweaty jazz music, Rudy Toot Toot is your nightmare. Animated by the legendary John Hubley, this short retells the classic ballad of Frankie and Johnny, but pushes the visual style into pure surrealism. Frankie catches her no-good lover Johnny cheating at a dance hall, and she shoots him dead. The trial that follows is a chaotic, psychedelic mess. The courtroom is filled with witnesses whose faces morph and stretch in grotesque ways. The prosecutor is a pompous, exaggerated figure who practically foams at the mouth, while the defense attorney is a sleazy, smooth-talking caricature. What makes it profoundly strange is the jarring juxtaposition of the upbeat, scat-singing soundtrack with the incredibly dark subject matter. People are dying, a woman's life is on the line, and the background characters are just dancing and snapping their fingers. The color palette is harsh, using clashing reds, blues, and yellows that burn into your retinas. It feels like you are watching the 1950s underworld through a kaleidoscope. It was definitely not meant for children, yet its cartoonish style meant it inevitably ended up mixed in with kids' programming later on, leaving a generation deeply confused about why a cartoon lady was going to the electric chair. The Telltale Heart, 1953. Edgar Allan Poe's classic tale of murder and guilt was brought to life by UPA, and it is arguably one of the most terrifying things ever broadcast on television in the 1950s. There are no funny animals here. There is no comic relief. There is only a nameless narrator, animated in a harsh, jagged, angular style, descending into absolute madness. The short utilizes a technique where the background shifts and warps based on the narrator's psychological state, making the viewer feel his creeping paranoia. The most infamous scene involves the murder of the old man. Instead of showing the violence directly, the screen goes completely black, and we only hear the horrific, realistic sound of a struggle. When the light returns, the visual representation of the dead man's vulture eye lingers on screen, pulsing and staring into the audience's soul. James Mason's voiceover is so intensely dramatic and unhinged that it borders on uncomfortable. It was nominated for an Academy Award, but television networks were genuinely baffled by it. When it aired on TV, parents were outraged, complaining that it gave their children nightmares. It stands today as a bizarre anomaly of the 1950s, a mainstream animated release that functions purely as a horror film, completely abandoning the expectation that cartoons were supposed to be cheerful or safe. Christopher Crumpet, 1953. Created by Robert Cannon for UPA, Christopher Crumpet introduces us to a little boy who has a highly problematic superpower. When he gets angry, he literally transforms into a giant, roaring, destructive monster. The short starts with a relatively normal setup. Christopher wants a toy helicopter. His mother says no, and he throws a tantrum. But instead of just crying, the boy's body swells, his clothes rip, and he becomes a hulking beast that smashes through the walls of his suburban home. The strangeness comes from how the adults react. They don't call a doctor or an exorcist. They just sigh and accept that their son is a literal monster. His mother casually talks to the giant, fanged creature, as if it's just a boy being slightly naughty. The visual of this sharp-toothed, googly-eyed giant terrorizing a perfectly drawn 1950s living room is deeply jarring. It plays like a metaphor for the repressed rage of the suburban American family, but on the surface, it's just completely insane. The monster design is ugly and unsettling, lacking the charm of typical cartoon creatures. It's a bizarre, almost depressing look at childhood, suggesting that underneath the polite exterior of every 1950s kid lies a feral, uncontrollable beast, waiting to destroy the American dream. As television screens multiplied across the country, the demand for content became insatiable. This led to a strange phenomenon: the importation of foreign cartoons that had absolutely no cultural context for American audiences. What seemed normal in Eastern Europe or Asia suddenly became surreal, incomprehensible art when dropped into a US living room. Sometimes, however, the strangest imports came from places you wouldn't expect, carrying an aura of old-world fairy tale darkness that clashed hard with American sensibilities. The Adventures of Puss in Boots, 1952. While technically an Italian production by Luigi Veronese that made its way to American screens in the 1950s, this version of Puss in Boots is a surreal, plotless fever dream that confuses everyone who watches it. Unlike the modern versions, there is no swashbuckling hero here. The cat is a bizarre, elongated creature with human-like, unblinking eyes that stares directly at the camera. The animation is highly experimental, relying on geometric shapes, constant morphing, and a complete disregard for the laws of physics. The plot, if you can call it that, involves Puss wandering through abstract landscapes, tricking an equally bizarre king, and defeating an ogre who looks like a walking pile of garbage. There is no dialogue, only a strange, wandering musical score that feels entirely disconnected from the action on screen. The character movements are jittery and unnatural, giving the whole thing an eerie, haunted quality. For American kids used to the clear-cut morality of Warner Brothers or Disney, this abstract European nightmare must have been incredibly disorienting. It feels less like a fairy tale and more like a strange academic experiment in color and motion. It remains one of the most obscure and visually unsettling cartoons ever to creep onto 1950s television screens. But it wasn't just foreign films or high-art studios acting weird. Some of the biggest names in animation were producing shorts that made absolutely no sense, driven by bizarre corporate mandates or sheer creative exhaustion. The 1950s saw the rise of the educational cartoon, a genre that frequently went off the rails. When you try to explain complex adult concepts to children using cartoon animals, the results are often accidentally terrifying and deeply, profoundly weird. Fudget's Budget, 1954. Trying to teach children about macroeconomics is a doomed venture, but UPA decided to try anyway with Fudget's Budget. The result is a surreal, almost dystopian short film about a family's descent into financial ruin. The titular Fudget is a vague, blob-like man who cannot stop spending money. The short uses highly abstract imagery to represent economic concepts. For instance, when Fudget gets a paycheck, the money literally flies out of his hands and morphs into various consumer goods, suits, hats, and furniture that swarm around him like angry hornets. The weirdest moment comes when the cartoon attempts to visualize inflation and taxes. The background turns into a jagged red nightmarescape, and giant, disembodied hands reach out of the walls to snatch away Fudget's belongings. His wife and child watch in horror as their home literally shrinks around them due to debt. It's a deeply cynical, frightening look at capitalism that plays like a communist propaganda film disguised as a cute cartoon. The abstract shapes and harsh colors make it feel like a panic attack. It is incredibly bizarre to think that children sat in theaters eating popcorn while watching an animated representation of a man being psychologically crushed by the weight of late-stage capitalism. But in the 1950s, this passed for family entertainment. Economics wasn't the only heavy topic animators were tackling. As the Cold War ramped up, the landscape of television changed dramatically. Budgets were slashed, and studios had to invent new, cheaper ways to make cartoons. This technological desperation birthed one of the most notoriously unsettling visual styles in the history of broadcasting. It was a technique so lazy, yet so uncanny, that it has haunted the internet ever since. Get ready to meet the grandfather of the creepy internet meme, Clutch Cargo, 1959. Clutch Cargo is famous today for exactly one reason: Synchrovox. Running out of money, the creators invented a horrifying process where they filmed live-action actors speaking, cut out their mouths, and superimposed them over static drawings of cartoon characters. The result is a visual nightmare. You are watching a stiff, poorly drawn cartoon man, and suddenly, a hyper-realistic, fleshy, heavily lipsticked human mouth starts moving on his face. The mouths never quite match the size of the drawn heads, and because the rest of the face is frozen, the characters look like terrifying ventriloquist dummies brought to life by black magic. The adventures themselves are incredibly bizarre, involving Clutch, a gruff pilot, and his young ward Spinner, traveling the world getting into absurd Cold War-era escapades. But nobody remembers the plot. They only remember the creeping dread of watching a live-action pair of lips floating on a piece of paper. It completely shatters the illusion of animation, plunging the viewer into the uncanny valley. It feels like a bizarre psychiatric experiment. Clutch Cargo proved that in the late 1950s, studios would rather terrify children with grotesque human mouths than spend money on actual animation. Synchrovox was the extreme end of cost-cutting. But across the animation industry, artists were trying to push the boundaries of what the medium could do. Some wanted to combine animation with live action in ways that weren't completely horrifying. This led to bizarre hybrid films where cartoons interacted with the real world, creating logistical nightmares and surreal visuals that blurred the line between reality and the animated page. The next entry is a masterclass in this strange, disorienting hybrid style. The Invisible Moustique, 1954. This highly obscure Terrytoon short is a baffling mix of live action and animation that makes very little logical sense. The plot revolves around a French-speaking mosquito named Moustique, who is completely invisible, except for his cartoon sunglasses. The live-action portion features real actors in a park, swatting at nothing, reacting to a bug the audience cannot see. Then, the cartoon mosquito appears, a bizarre, squiggly line, with a big nose and those floating sunglasses, interacting with the real grass and real people. The juxtaposition is incredibly jarring. Because the mosquito is invisible, the animators didn't have to worry about matching his scale or perspective perfectly, leading to moments where the cartoon elements seem to exist in a different dimension than the live-action world. The sound design is equally strange, featuring a constant, irritating buzzing sound, and the mosquito speaking in an exaggerated, peppy French accent. It feels like an outtake from a completely different, much weirder movie. Why Terrytoons decided to combine a hyper-realistic setting with an invisible, talking French mosquito is a mystery lost to time. It's a surreal, almost David Lynch-esque experience that leaves you questioning your own eyesight. While some studios were experimenting with live action, others were diving headfirst into pure abstraction, abandoning character animation altogether. The 1950s saw a brief, weird trend of visual music, cartoons that were just shapes and colors moving to a beat. It was animation as a purely sensory experience. The most famous practitioners of this weirdness were actually world-class jazz musicians, who decided to step into the animation studio, resulting in films that played like psychedelic light shows, decades before the hippie movement even existed. The Hole, 1957, directed by John Hubley, and featuring the legendary jazz trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie. The Hole is an existential, improvisational animated short that feels like it was made for beatniks in a smoky cafe, not kids on a Saturday morning. The premise is absurdly minimal. Two construction workers are sitting next to a hole in the ground, and they start having a philosophical, completely improvised conversation about the possibility of an accidental nuclear holocaust. The animation is loose, sketchy, and constantly shifting, mirroring the freewheeling nature of Gillespie's jazz score. The characters' faces morph and change expression mid-sentence, giving the whole thing a highly unstable, dreamlike quality. There is no traditional plot, no climax, and no resolution. It's just two blue-collar guys contemplating the sudden, fiery annihilation of the human race, while doodles float around their heads. The juxtaposition of the mundane setting with the apocalyptic subject matter, all set to frantic bebop jazz, creates an atmosphere of intense, surreal anxiety. It's a fascinating artifact of the Cold War era, capturing the very real dread of the time, but packaging it in a bizarre, abstract cartoon that refuses to follow a single rule of conventional storytelling. Dizzy Gillespie wasn't the only one getting in on the abstract animation game. As the decade wore on, the line between fine art and cartooning became increasingly blurred. Animators were treated less like studio employees and more like avant-garde filmmakers. This resulted in shorts that were essentially moving paintings, beautiful to look at, but completely alienating to anyone expecting a coherent story. Our next entry takes this artistic ambition to a bizarre, almost hallucinogenic extreme, focusing on the surreal transformation of a musician. The Violinist, 1957, created by the brilliant George Dunning, who would later direct The Yellow Submarine. The Violinist is a surreal, wordless short that plays out like an animated acid trip. It starts normally enough, with a man playing a violin on a stage. But soon, the music takes over, and the physical world begins to break down. The violinist's body stretches and distorts. His head detaches and floats into the sky. The violin morphs into a giant, breathing organism that swallows the musician whole. The background shifts from a concert hall to a bizarre, cosmic void, filled with floating geometric shapes and pulsing colors. The animation style constantly changes, shifting from smooth, fluid lines to harsh, scratchy etchings in a matter of seconds. There is no narrative logic holding it together. It is purely a visual representation of music. It is incredibly mesmerizing, but also deeply unsettling. It feels like you are trapped inside the mind of a composer having a mental breakdown. For a 1950s audience, this kind of total abandonment of reality in a cartoon was shocking. It stands today as a bizarre, beautiful, and completely incomprehensible piece of animation history that defies you to make sense of it. For all the artistic experimentation happening in the high-end studios, the lower end of the market was producing a completely different kind of strangeness. When budgets were low and deadlines were tight, weirdness wasn't a creative choice. It was a side effect of sheer incompetence. But sometimes, that incompetence crossed a line from being merely bad to being deeply, offensively bizarre. The following entry is widely considered one of the most notoriously awful and culturally insensitive cartoons of the entire decade, courtesy of a producer known as the Ed Wood of animation. Bucky and Pepito, 1959. Bucky and Pepito is a profoundly strange and deeply controversial cartoon that barely functions as coherent media. The premise sounds like a standard buddy comedy. A smart American boy and his lazy Mexican sidekick go on adventures. But the execution is a masterclass in racist stereotyping and surreal bad writing. Pepito is drawn with incredibly exaggerated, lazy features and speaks in an offensive, mangled accent that makes him nearly impossible to understand. The strangeness comes from the plots, which are completely non sequitur. In one episode, they encounter a bear, and the bear suddenly starts speaking with a refined British accent for absolutely no reason. The animation is atrocious, with characters frequently missing limbs or having their eyes placed in the wrong spots on their heads. The voice acting sounds like it was recorded in a tin can by people who had never seen a script before. It plays like a bizarre fever dream created by someone who had heard of Mexico but had never actually met a Mexican person. It is so aggressively weird and culturally tone-deaf that it has become a legendary oddity, a perfect storm of cheap animation, offensive writing, and absolute narrative chaos. Bucky and Pepito proved that bad intentions and low budgets bred a unique kind of horror. But the uncanny valley wasn't just reserved for racist stereotypes and superimposed lips. The late 1950s saw a rush of science fiction cartoons trying to cash in on the space race and the panic surrounding Sputnik, and the results were frequently chilling. When you combine the cheapness of television animation with the vast, empty void of outer space, you get something uniquely isolating and weird. Space Angel, 1959. Riding the same terrifying wave as Clutch Cargo, Space Angel used the dreaded Synchrovox technique to tell stories of intergalactic adventure. But somehow, it managed to be even creepier. The show followed an astronaut named Scott McCloud, who had a secret identity as the Space Angel. Because the characters' bodies were just static drawings, the show consisted entirely of people standing perfectly still, their dead, unblinking cartoon eyes staring into the middle distance, while their hyper-realistic, fleshy mouths moved rapidly. The plots were surprisingly serious, dealing with alien kidnappings and space piracy, which made the bizarre visual style even more jarring. Imagine watching a tense scene where a character is being threatened by a laser, but he can't move his body to dodge it. He can only move his lips. The backgrounds were often stark, minimalist spacescapes that added to the feeling of cold, mechanical isolation. It felt less like an exciting space opera and more like a dystopian future where human consciousness is trapped inside frozen paper bodies. It is a profoundly unsettling viewing experience, turning the wonder of space exploration into a claustrophobic, lip-synced nightmare. The American animation industry wasn't the only one producing weirdness during this decade. As global tensions rose, cultural exchange programs and cheap syndication deals brought foreign animation to U.S. shores. Soviet animation, in particular, was heavily subsidized by the state, which meant artists didn't have to worry about toy sales or network censors. They could make pure, unadulterated art. Sometimes, that art was beautiful. Other times, it was completely baffling and nightmarish, like our next entry from the legendary Soyuz Multfilm studio. The Jolly Frogs, 1958, imported from the Soviet Union and occasionally syndicated on American television, The Jolly Frogs is a deeply unsettling piece of folklore animation that traumatized any child who accidentally stumbled upon it. The short features a group of anthropomorphic frogs who live near a murky swamp. The art style is not the clean, bright style of Disney, but a dark, muddy, highly detailed watercolor style that looks like it was painted on wet paper. The frogs themselves are not cute. They have baggy, wrinkled skin, deep-set human eyes, and creepy, wide smiles. The jolly part of the title is highly ironic, as the short plays out like a fever dream. The frogs engage in bizarre, ritualistic dancing, singing strange, discordant choral music that sounds more like a haunted church choir than a cartoon jingle. There is no clear plot, just a series of unsettling vignettes involving the frogs interacting with terrifying creatures of the swamp. It has the distinct vibe of an ancient pagan curse brought to life. For American kids used to singing mice and talking dogs, this dark, atmospheric Soviet oddity felt like a glimpse into a completely alien and deeply frightening world. Whether it was Soviet frogs or American monsters, the 1950s were unafraid to give kids the creeps. But sometimes the strangeness wasn't visual. It was conceptual. Animators loved taking everyday objects or mundane situations and warping them into bizarre, surreal puzzles. It was a way to subvert expectations and mess with the audience's sense of logic. Our next entry takes a completely normal scenario and twists it into a weird, logic-defying spectacle that leaves you scratching your head. Gumbazia, 1953. Before he created the iconic Gumby, animator Art Clokey made a bizarre 3-minute short film called Gumbazia as a student project. Funded by a visionary dean who saw the future of animation, Gumbazia is essentially a mass of colorful, shape-shifting clay blobs moving to a jazz beat. There are no characters. There is no story. It is just a relentless, hypnotic sequence of clay, expanding, contracting, morphing into phallic shapes, and exploding into colors. It was heavily inspired by the abstract Disney short Fantasia, but replaces the elegant classical music and graceful fairies with pounding, chaotic jazz and lumpy, primal clay. The word trippy is overused, but there is literally no other word to describe watching a giant blue lump of clay pulse rhythmically on a black background. It feels like a transmission from an alien dimension. While it was never meant to be a commercial cartoon, it did birth one of the strangest franchises in television history. But standing on its own, Gumbazia is a weird, experimental artifact that proves the 1950s animation underground was just as wild and unhinged as the counterculture of the 1960s that would follow. Claymation was one frontier, but the traditional 2D animation studios were still finding ways to warp reality. Even the most established, famous cartoon characters were occasionally subjected to bizarre, experimental episodes that threw out their established formulas. Warner Brothers, known for their sharp comedy and Looney Tunes, occasionally dipped into pure, unadulterated surrealism, creating sequences that felt like they belonged in an avant-garde film festival rather than a comedy short. The Whole Idea, 1955. This incredibly obscure Warner Brothers short, directed by the legendary Bob McKimson, is one of the strangest things the studio ever produced. It follows a scientist who invents a portable hole, not a hole in the ground, a literal, black, circular void that he can carry around and throw onto any surface. The concept itself is wonderfully absurd, but the execution gets deeply weird, very fast. The scientist uses the holes for mundane tasks, like dropping a hole on a wall to create a window, or throwing one on a bank vault to rob it. But as the short progresses, the holes begin to act like a malevolent force. They multiply, they spread, and eventually, the entire world is consumed by floating, black voids. The final minutes of the cartoon are surprisingly dark and apocalyptic, showing civilization collapsing as people fall into infinite nothingness. The scientist, having lost control of his invention, is left floating in a void himself. It's a bizarre existential ending for a studio known for slapstick comedy. The visual of a world literally eaten alive by portable black holes is haunting, making The Whole Idea a uniquely strange and surprisingly philosophical entry in the Warner Brothers catalog. Existential dread was a recurring theme in these bizarre 1950s shorts, but it usually came from the independent or high art studios. When the mainstream comic book industry tried to get in on the animation game, the weirdness took on a completely different flavor. Comic books were full of monsters, aliens, and weird science, and translating that to the screen often resulted in cheap, chaotic messes. The final two entries on our list showcase the absolute peak of bizarre, cheap, superhero and sci-fi animation as the decade came to a close. Kidnapped, 1958. Directed by George Dunning for the UPA. Kidnapped is a short that defies description. It starts as a seemingly normal story about a man who gets abducted by a mysterious, shadowy organization. But the narrative immediately fractures. The kidnapped man escapes, or maybe he doesn't. He is chased through a city that constantly shifts and changes its architecture. The walls breathe, the streets fold in on themselves, and his pursuers are faceless, geometric shapes. The animation style is a chaotic mix of stark line drawings and sudden splashes of aggressive color. There is no dialogue, only a bizarre rhythmic soundtrack of footfalls, heavy breathing, and discordant piano notes. It plays out like a paranoid schizophrenic's worst nightmare. The concept of being kidnapped is twisted from a physical crime into a psychological trap. The man isn't just being held captive by people, he is being held captive by the very fabric of reality. It is an intensely uncomfortable, claustrophobic watch. It completely abandons any notion of entertainment in favor of pure, abstract anxiety. It is one of the darkest, most bizarre shorts ever produced by a major American animation studio. UPA clearly had a monopoly on existential animated terror, and by this point, the studio was collapsing financially. But as the 1950s drew to a close, the television landscape was completely dominated by superheroes. Comic book companies were licensing their characters out to anyone with a camera and a basic understanding of animation. This led to some of the most notoriously cheap, lazy, and utterly baffling cartoons of the decade. Our final entry takes a beloved comic book concept and strips it down to its most absurd, incomprehensible core. The Thing, 1959. Produced as part of the Fantastic Four radio show package, this cartoon segment is an exercise in pure, unadulterated weirdness. It features the Thing, the rock-covered monster from the Fantastic Four, but completely removed from any superhero context. The animation is staggeringly cheap. The Thing looks less like a superhero and more like a giant, lumpy, misshapen potato with arms and legs. He doesn't fight Dr. Doom. He wanders around a bizarre, poorly drawn landscape getting into mundane, sitcom-style misunderstandings with random civilians. Because the animation is so limited, the Thing barely moves, just sliding across the screen like a stone on a table. The voice acting is bizarrely cheery, completely at odds with his monstrous appearance. There is no overarching plot, no stakes, and no connection to the comic book source material. It is just a grumpy rock monster existing in a void, complaining about everyday problems. It feels like a bizarre fever dream you'd have after falling asleep reading a comic book. It is the perfect, chaotic endpoint to the strangest decade in animation history. The 1950s weren't just about innocent fun and mouse ears. They were a breeding ground for surreal nightmares, avant-garde experiments, and cheap, uncanny aberrations. These 17 cartoons prove that underneath the polished, perfect surface of the era, animators were losing their minds and taking hours with them. If you survived watching all of these without questioning reality, you're tougher than a 1950s kid. Like this video if you dare, and subscribe for more animated madness.